Thank you very much, Michael. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here. I also hope after today we won't have all those talking heads arguing with each other about what I said. But we will have an opportunity at the end of this to have a serious discussion as to whether or not you agree and whether or not your stories to watch might be different from ours, because the coming year is a very, very exciting one indeed. So we've got 6 stories for you today, actually. So look, this is Paris, and you may wonder why that picture will emerge. Is because what we did in Paris last month was an extremely important thing. But many people, as they look at 2015, the year ending, see a year of real trouble. Here in the United States, for example, we don't really appreciate the issue of refugees. Ambassador Björn Löfvall here, sitting on the front row, ambassador for Sweden, is a very good example of coming from a country, less than 10 million population, 150,000 refugees joining in the last year, and could well happen again this year. Incredibly disruptive. Everybody knows that last year was a year in which terrorism spiked. Everybody knows that last year was a year of massive disappointment on the economy. Less here in the United States, which is clearly a real bright spot, as President Obama certainly told us last night, but in the emerging world, massive disappointment in terms of the economy, and actually in Europe as well, quite difficult. Is slow growth, as many leading economists now believe, is that the new normal? So 2015, a pretty grim year, but huge signs of hope in the last year. And it wasn't just the approval of the sustainability goals, the Sustainable Development Goals in Paris. I had the privilege of being in this room, which is the Pope spoke, and then actually Shakira sang, and then the United Nations, by acclamation, every country on the planet approve the Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets to implement by 2030. And head of state after head of state stood up and said, these represent the views of our nation, our people. So it was that, but then it was also Paris, where there was a really remarkable sense of a new multilateralism. Global problems require international cooperation, and that has been in drastically short supply for the last 2 decades. In many ways, 2015 sort of perhaps introduced a new era of multilateralism, actually, a different kind of multilateralism. And so, if you like, 2016 has a theme in our line of business. It's going from commitments, design, and promises into action, where we need to replumb the system. We need to actually pour the cement, or hopefully not too much cement, but we need to act on what was promised. So that's, if you like, the theme of most of, in fact, all of the stories we're going to talk about tonight. It's what we like to call the big pivot. The pivot from design and agreement into action. Certainly at the World Resource Institute, we're reorganizing ourselves in order to be helpful moving towards action. So let's plunge into the stories first. Pretty obviously, the first story is, are they actually going to deliver what was promised in Paris? You know, I had the privilege of being in the original Earth Summit in 1992. That's how old I am. When, as heads of state came up and signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Biodiversity Convention, there was a sense of real moral imperative there. It really was. For the next 2 days to 2 decades, we were drastically lacking that sense of moral imperative. That came back, actually, in Paris. Those who were in this room there had an amazing sense that we might just be onto something here. So what was promised? Well, I think you all know this, so we can be brief. All of these, even 3 years ago, would have been, my goodness me, if we get that, that would be fantastic. 187 countries saying we want to be part of the solution. A long-term goal that doesn't only say 1.5 to 2 degrees, it says neutrality with regard to carbon emissions. An agreement that every 5 years we come back and we try and ratchet things up. Transparency, all on the same page with regard to reporting adaptation, which is obviously massively important to low-income countries, and even financial support. Maybe not quite what we'd hoped, but still very, very important. So that's in the agreement. But let's be honest. This is where the world is heading today. After Paris, the so-called INDCs, which I think everybody here now knows what they are, intentional, nationally determined contributions. These are the 187 promises, if you like. If you add them all up and you make medium assumptions as to what will happen after 2025, 2030, you get to this. I'm sorry, it's in Celsius, but let's just imagine it's 3 degrees Celsius. That's about 5.2 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is seriously problematic, if that's as far as we go. This is where we need to be. So this is where Paris says we want to be. And so what we have to start sensing is whether or not these INDCs and all the associated measures or complementary measures will get us down here and we'll start ratcheting towards this position. So the question is, what will countries seize the momentum that was set in place over the last year? April the 22nd, be there in New York. Countries will come and sign what they promised in Paris, and then there will become, both before and after that, a ratification process in parliaments and so on. What will they be saying as they do that? And as we look at this map, which is 187 countries, they're all the ones that have colors. Of those, most, the blues, they have actual targets for greenhouse gas emissions. The greens have targets for greenhouse gas emissions per unit of GDP, for example. So China and India, that's the route they've gone. There are some, they're the yellows, low-income countries, that said, look, we want to be part of the solution, but primarily we're going to worry more about adaptation and so on, so they don't actually have targets. There's 135 that actually have greenhouse gas targets. So what should we be looking for? We should, by the middle of this year, be getting a sense of how they're going about delivering those. You know, is it just sticking in the Ministry of Environment who goes to cabinet meetings and tries to sort of say, you must get on with this? Or is it taking hold within ministries of finance and planning and energy and agriculture and so on? And organizations like ours and many of the others, some of whom are represented here today, will be working extremely hard at the country level, and we'll be getting a real sense of, is there a seriousness here? Is there a national committee that is now designing where you're going to be in 2020, for example? You'll start getting a really good sense. And some key countries are also worth watching. So, for example, India, crucially important country. Prime Minister Modi came to power with the goal of improving economic growth. One of the first things he did, he said, I see my predecessor government has a plan to increase solar energy from 3 gigawatts to 20 gigawatts by 2022. I'm going to increase that to 100 gigawatts by 2022. One of the biggest ramp-ups in solar energy in the history of the world, quite frankly. Why did he do it? It's not because he's a member of the Sierra Club. He did it because he actually believes this is going to be good for his economy. He is going to create an industry in India that is going to be transformative. By the end of 2016, we will know whether this massive ramp-up is actually going to be possible. We'll start seeing all kinds of things, so that's what we should watch. So, story number one, will the momentum from Paris at the national level, will it continue? Okay, are you still with me? So, story number two, related. Paris was possible in part because there was an intellectual revolution that's taken place. Part of that was something we call the New Climate Economy, which was part of the Global Commission on the Economy and Growth, the Economy and Climate Change. But I mean, this was the result of many sort of pieces of analysis and changing understandings, which basically can be captured like this. This is President Felipe Calderon from Mexico, who chaired the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. And he said, you know, through most of my political career, I believe this, that economic growth and climate action, that's action to address climate change, are sort of trade-offs. You know, I'd like to act on climate change, but it's sort of it's going to be quite costly. So please, understand that I've got to make that trade-off. He said, while I was president and I chaired the G20 and I put green growth on the agenda, he said, this is what I believed. Economic growth can be consistent with climate action. And that's what he tried to do at his G20. And he basically said, look, we can have green growth. He said, I believe actually that economic growth is only possible with climate action. It's a very important trend. And this, if you like, not everybody is here, by the way, in their beliefs. So not everyone in that room last night was down here, by the way. Quite a lot of them are still up here. But there's something going on, and it's an intellectual journey. And what matters is not what researchers say. What matters is what's going on in the private corporations and the boardrooms around the world, and what's going on in the cities of the world. And I just want to say this is the next story to watch. And it relates to businesses and it relates to cities. Businesses are really changing the way they go about business. And not everybody, it's still a minority, but there are 1,000 companies that are calling now for a price on carbon. 150 US corporations, as you know, have signed on to the support pledge for climate action. This is very important, something we are heavily involved in, along with WWF, CDP, and We Mean Business, which basically is what we call science-based targets. If you are a corporation, for the last 15 years, you've been saying, oh, we're doing better on climate change. This says, you can't just do better, you've got to do enough. And this is science-based targets. These are corporations who are willing to sign up and say, we're looking at the science, we're going to be totally transparent about it, we're going to have organizations like WWF and WRI and others come in, advise us, look at what's going on, and we are going to do enough. 116 signed up. So, and at Paris, everybody there, there's a meeting that I had the privilege of addressing briefly. This was a meeting chaired by Ban Ki-moon that brought together about 80 CEOs of major international corporations. And everybody there said, look, there's something different going on here. Never before have we had this degree of private engagement in this issue. I see over there Clint Vince, who's one of our board members, who's head of energy at Dentons, who epitomizes this. And a company like in major, largest law company in the world, now engaging, advising, changing the way things in a quite different way to what would have been before. So will business follow through? And these, by the way, of that 116 companies that have signed up to do science-based targets, 10 of them, they're these, have now actually designed those science-based targets. They're out there. They're available to look at. They can be monitored. This year, how many more will we see that actually say, okay, we've signed up for science-based targets. This is what we're going to do. Watch us. And that does mean, by the way, pretty profound decarbonization as you move forward. So what to watch? Will businesses deliver? This is a very important issue. Will businesses, who now are extremely good at giving speeches on these subjects, will they start putting their money and their lobbying efforts where those speeches are? We did a study last year, and we concluded by looking at statements, public statements, that about 60% of major corporations in the United States and other Western countries are actually saying the right thing. But of those, less than a quarter of those are actually aligning their lobbying efforts behind it. And in particularly important here are trade associations. And we're doing a major piece of work this year on trade associations. Do the trade associations actually represent their members in lobbying for the right thing? So this is the second thing. And I also mentioned that cities are very important. Paris was astonishing in that 425 mayors of large cities came and they said, we're going to sign up to something called the Compact of Mayors. The Compact of Mayors says, if you are a city, you will measure your greenhouse gases in a very transparent way, and you will publish them every year, and you will also have a plan that will be more ambitious than your nation's plan to reduce your greenhouse gases. So this is pretty serious. The question is, why do they do it? They certainly don't have to. There's no law for most countries that says you have to do it. They're doing it because actually they realize that the messages of the new climate economy are actually right. And I just wanted to go and say, so will cities deliver? Is Mayor Bloomberg, who's the Ban Ki-moon's special representative, as you know, on cities and climate, sort of led this whole effort. This is the Paris City Hall, very grand and elegant. So will that new narrative, will that start to emerge clearly in all the major fora this year? This is a picture of Quito, Ecuador. Habitat 3 will be there once every 10 years. It's the biggest city meeting in the world. And they will all gather there, all the mayors of cities. And the question is, what will be the mood music there? What will be the narrative there? Will it be the old-fashioned urbanization that basically designs cities around automobiles, as we've been doing for the last 100 years? Or will it say, no, actually we want to design cities around people. We want them to be compact. We want them to be connected. We want them to be resilient, because if we do that, as all the analysis shows, you will save a lot of money. You will also make your economy more efficient. You will not spend 10% of your city income on congestion and another 10% on pollution, which is what's happening now. So what you're having now is the cities are being dragged down by the wrong form of urbanization. And so the question for this year is, will you see, of those 425 cities that have signed up, will you start to see them increasingly being transparent, learning how to measure their greenhouse gases, coming out with plans? And will you see in these major international fora, and there's another one, by the way, in May here in Washington, which will be a follow-up to the Paris meeting, where cities will feature prominently, will you start seeing this narrative? Because it's only when this narrative of compact, connected, coordinated, resilient cities come that you will then start to see a tipping point and a real virtuous cycle. So that's story number 2, will the message take root? Okay, that's number 2. We're now going to accelerate a little bit. Story number 3, if we are going to be successful at getting the degree of transformation that is required in the next 15 years to 2030 that will implement the Sustainable Development Goals and implement the Paris Agreement, we are going to need to do something about the financial system, quite frankly. So story number 3 is about green finance. Will the financial system evolve? And many people, when you say green finance, they think, well, that means creating funds for like the Green Climate Fund. And that is important. It is important to have special funds, and that's raising billions, if you like. But more important than that is shifting billions. Because in the next 15 years, the world will invest $90 trillion in infrastructure. Now, not all of that will need to be shifted to other things, but a lot of that will need to be shifted. And the way that needs to happen is good government policies, but also shifting in financial systems so that money will be made available. And let me just sort of take you through just a simple approach to what really this means, because there's a lot of confusion around green finance. What is the financial system? It's basically households and corporations saving money, and they put it into financial organizations like banks and bond markets and equities and institutional investments like insurance and pension funds, and that's called the financial system. And then the financial system lends to projects and investments. So savings goes to investment. And most countries in the world, this is going fine, and this is pretty brown. And so what really greening the financial system, it says, what would it take to do that? What would it take to get money to go to the right place? So then you have to ask, well, why isn't it happening? And there's really 2 problems. One is what we call the demand side. Quite frankly, there aren't very many really good projects that are asking for finance right now, up till now. This is going to change pretty radically now because of agreements that have happened. So there's going to be a big increase on the demand side. So we now have to turn to the supply side. And the question is, why is the financial system not willing to, or not able to lend adequately? And there's really several reasons, but 3 of them stand out. One is pretty hopeless at assessing environmental risk. Much better at assessing financial risk, such as shocks to interest rates and the possibility of recession, or even they're not always so good, but really bad at assessing environmental risk, and traditionally they haven't felt that's their job. Second, a very short-term focus. And third, very conservative lending culture. Financial institutions, and I know because I worked one for most of my life, financial institutions tend to want to provide money to what they've provided money for before. And they've been providing money for roads, for cars, gas-powered electricity generating plants a certain way, and that's what makes them comfortable. Actually moving to a new system, a new approach, requires getting out of the comfort zone, financing energy efficiency, financing the new urbanism, and public transportation, for example. So these are the supply side problems, and for the first time, we're now starting to see serious financial regulators, such as Mark Carney, who's not only governor of the Bank of England, he also chairs the Financial Stability Board of the G20. And so this year, he and other leaders have said, wait a minute, this is nuts. I mean, as financial regulators, we're supposed to be specialists on risk, and actually, there's huge environmental risks out there. Obviously, climate change is the biggest one. We need to get good at doing that. This is really important, by the way. And it's not only regulators, it's actually happening on the ground. This year, last year, for example, France passed a law that said you must, if you're a bank, you must declare financial risks, because that is part of your financial prudential obligations. This is China. I've had the privilege over the last year of co-chairing for the Chinese government something on green finance. And quite frankly, it's astonishing. They say, look, we don't like the fact that our financial system's lending over there. We wanted to lend over here to a green future. So they've been introducing all kinds of things, not just sort of green bond markets and regulations on that, but also disclosure requirements. They're thinking of having mandatory liability insurance for banks and so on. So you're starting to see change. And the interesting thing is China this year is the president of the G20. So there's going to be a meeting in, I guess it's November, is it? October, November, of the G20 in China. And China has said, we want to put green finance on the agenda. And so the Bank of England and the People's Bank of China have set up a working group precisely to do this. And the kind of things, I mean, we don't know exactly what they'll do, but this is one, for example, environmental stress tests. Do you remember 20 years ago, we didn't really know how to look at financial risks to banks, and then they invented stress tests, do you remember? But why don't we have environmental stress tests? That will be one of the things they discuss. Issues of disclosure guidelines. Watch for this in the G20. And by the way, also the G20 working group has asked Michael Bloomberg, who obviously knows a thing or two about finance, to chair a committee that will report at the end of this year on disclosure, and in particular the risks that financial institutions experience because of environment. So this is a very important thing to watch. But coming back to the special funds, we also need this year to look to see whether they're delivering. So the Green Climate Fund has now opened its doors, as you know, and it has plans to commit $2.5 billion this year. That's a lot of money for a brand new institution sitting in Korea. And if they do it, watch, whether or not they do it, we should watch, but watch, see what kind of projects. It'd be easy to do some rather old-fashioned type green projects. Will they leverage a lot of private money? That's what matters. Will they be catalytic? And this week, we will get a very good sense of how seriously they're taking their business in 2016. So also, it's worth looking at some of the new institutions, by the way. This year, the AIIB will make its first commitment. That's the Asia Infrastructure Bank. And these are sort of $100 billion capital equity banks, by the way. Also, the New Development Bank used to be called the BRICS Bank. And the Silk Road Fund, for example, these all based in Asia. This year, they will all start giving indications of how seriously they are going to take the issue of sustainability. And this is a difficult issue for them. And so we'll learn quite a bit. And finally, on the greening financial institutions, in Paris and before, we had some remarkable commitments from institutional investors. Now, institutional investors, remember there's 80 trillion institutional money is sort of in financial markets. And traditionally, they have not been leaders in financing green investments. But we're starting to see a more sophisticated approach which they call decarbonization. There's a coalition now, 600 billion, but they're hoping to get up to a trillion pretty quickly, that says we want to decarbonize our portfolio. Now, that's not just divestment from oil and coal and gas. It's actually something a little more serious than this. And we will know this year whether this starts picking up momentum and actually starts sending signals to financial markets. So that was story number 3. Will the financial system evolve? And now we're going to switch to something totally different, and you may wonder why we include it, but actually it's important. And it relates to all of us, and it relates to food, loss, and waste. Now, we actually did a little run-through of this with some of our teams, and somebody said, food loss and waste, I mean, you've just dealt with green finance and Paris, and suddenly you're worrying about, my kids not eating what's on their plate. So they weren't serious because they actually know why this is serious. Look, the world needs to increase food consumption by almost 70% by 2050. Partly because of population growth, partly because people will be wealthier. At the moment, we throw away or waste or lose 1/3 by weight of food, about 1/4 by nutritional value. So we throw away 1/3. Now, this is really dumb. Why? Well, for example, it costs almost $1 trillion. That's like taking $1 trillion from the world economy and just burning it every year. It also is dreadful for poverty reduction and food security. This is amazing. It also is terrible in terms of natural habitats because we're producing far more food than we need, if you think about it. It's like taking, this says China, but I could equally say the United States. It's like taking the entire United States, including Alaska, every single acre in the entire country, including cities, planting it to agriculture, harvesting it, burning it. That's the equivalent of food loss and waste every year. And finally, it's dreadful for climate change. If food loss and waste were a country, it would be the 3rd worst polluting country in the world, just after the United States. China, United States. So think about it. So this is obviously a smart thing to work on, and that's exactly why in the Sustainable Development Goals that were approved last September, food loss and waste had a wonderful goal, which was halve all food loss and waste by 2030, which would make a massive contribution to climate change, by the way, but also all those other things as well. So what to watch for? Well, first of all, there's no common approach to measure food. It's very analogous to 10 years ago, the greenhouse gas measurement. Everyone was measuring it differently, and 10 years ago, the World Resources Institute said, wait a minute, why don't we have a common approach? And so now, 92% of the Fortune 500 companies in the world report using the greenhouse gas protocol in a common approach. So too, all cities have agreed now that they're going to report in a common approach that we, together with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, have put together. We're doing exactly the same now on food loss and waste, together with FAO, UNEP, and a number of other organizations, including major retail chains. So what to watch? The Consumer Goods Forum, 400 members, they have already signed up to say, we're going to halve food loss and waste by 2025. And this is a very, very impressive 400 members, all of the sort of the major players here. And some of them, by the way, like Tesco here, which was the first company to have the courage to make public food loss and waste in its own care, if you like. And just in December, they brought out their second report, which showed that 55,000 tons of food were wasted in the care of Tesco's, which is, I think, the second largest, retail food store in the world. So, and they're gradually lowering it down. Now, they have the cost. I'd give you that huge number, not to blame them, to commend them, because they have the courage to say, this is a serious problem. Watch us each year. We're going to report this, and we're going to lower that. Will we see in 2016 more people more companies doing that. Craig Hansen over here, our Director of Food, Forest and Water, is leading this effort, which I'm going to come on to just in a second. The United States, by the way, was first out the gate almost. And a lot of European countries are also making very good progress, including Sweden, by the way, and Denmark, UK, France. The United States, within the same week that the SDGs were approved, they said, count us in. This is Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture, Gina McCarthy, saying, we in the United States are going to halve food loss and waste. That's difficult to do, though, actually. And so it requires a sort of a political momentum. One of the things that we're doing in Davos next week is we're going to launch what we call Champions 12.3. 12.3 is the SDG that says halve food loss and waste. And we believe strongly that not only do you need to know how to do this technically, but actually you need to create a movement. And so there will be a very large number of ministers and CEOs of major corporations that will be announced as part of this coalition called the Champions 12.3. And we will then use that once a year. We'll be reporting on how goes the battle, sort of thing. But in addition, all these champions will not only within their own companies or countries take this seriously, they will become champions and ambassadors to move forward the political momentum. So that is, that's story number 4, food loss and waste. And now you know why it's so important. I'm sure you did already. Now we're in the home stretch now, I promise. So we've had 4, and there's 2 more left. As you can imagine, we need something on the biggest country in the world, which is China. China faces extraordinary choices, as I think everybody knows. This sort of, if you like, symbolizes China for the last 2.5 decades. I mean, unbelievable. I mean, just think about it. A 10-fold income in real terms in a quarter of a century. I mean, never before in history has anything like that happened. Fabulous, and no wonder they're happy with their flag. But I think everybody here knows we face a very, very volatile time in China economically as they move towards what the government there calls a new normal of lower growth, but also much more volatile. I mean, this is the Shanghai stock market. Just since last summer, look how from 5,000 down to 2,500. And by the way, twice in the first week of 2016, they had to stop trading in Shanghai because the circuit breakers were triggered because prices were falling so rapidly. So economically volatile, but also, I mean, the model is just not working with regard to environmental damage. In December 2016, for the first time ever, China, in several northern cities, declared what they call red alerts. That means close the schools and close many of the companies. This is very serious, and it is totally central to the government's thinking. This is not us or anybody telling them this. They know this inside and out. And President Xi, you know, and other leaders have made the point, look, we now have to shift from quantity of growth to quality of growth, giving really serious attention. Now, what to look for? Well, the 13th five-year plan will be approved in March 2016, and that's the plan through 2016, and it is an extraordinarily important document. And remember, when you slow down and you have a lot less money, you can respond to environmental problems in 2 ways. What most countries would do is cut back on investing in pollution control and green investments. And that would be the easy thing to do. But it would be the disastrous thing to do. And I think the government is fully aware of that. Already they've made a number of announcements over the last year. You're familiar with them. Really sort of pretty impressive, reduced carbon intensity by 60 to 65% by 2030 and 40 to 45% by 2020. But what to look for in the new plan? There are already plans for wind and solar for 2020, for example, 100 gigawatts of solar by 2020, 200 gigawatts of wind by 2020. Some of those working on these issues within the administration say, Actually, watch, we're gonna ramp them up even more. Watch for that. That would be quite an important indication. Coal, exceedingly important. A big question. Remember, China has said they'll peak greenhouse gases by 2030, but coal use will peak much before that, and many people believe it's already peaked. It fell slightly in 2014. In the first 10 months of 2015, it seemed to fall again. So if you look at all the electricity generated in China, less coal was used last year and the year before than the previous year. So don't believe it when people say, oh, they're opening massive new coal plants every week now. That used to be the case, but something is really important, partly because they've already put some caps on the use of coal in certain areas. Watch to see whether those caps will become stronger and will grow geographically. Also watch regulations on financial institutions about how much you can lend for coal. So this is a really important subject. I think everyone here is aware of the fact that President Xi, when he came to Washington, said, look, 2017, we're going to have a nationwide cap and trade system. And as you know, they have 5 cities and 2 provinces that already have those pilot programs. 2016, we will know whether or not this is going to happen in 2017, because they're learning from these pilots, and it will start becoming clear as to which of the different models, and the reason they have pilots is they're trying to figure out what might work best, and they'll probably put something better together that will be, if you like, a combination. So this is actually quite important. So too, as we've already talked about cities, China's role in cities is very, very central, clearly. China was the first country that sort of came up with this notion of low-carbon cities. And the question is why, and what do they mean by that? And what they really mean by that is not only we want to be low-carbon because that's good for climate change, but more importantly, they realize, consistent with the new climate economy messaging, that actually carbon emissions are an indication of economic inefficiency. So their notion of low carbon cities is we want modern cities. We don't want the fact that people are spending 2 hours in automobiles to get to work. We actually would like different kinds of cities. So currently they have about, I think, 42 low carbon cities. This year, let's see if they go up to 100 as they start thinking through what do we really want? How do we scale up this notion of more efficient cities? So too, amazingly, even though China's had a huge building boom up till now, the number of buildings in cities, well, the square footage will triple by 2030. So you think how many bricks are going to be laid? And the question is, what kind of cities will they, what kind of buildings will they be? Will they have environmental standards? Will they require energy efficiency? And so this is all to play for. This is a massive, what China will do on building efficiencies and green building in the coming decade, and we'll know something about that by the end of this year. The way it works is that in March, the Congress approves the 5-year plan, and then for the rest of the year, there will be a number of sort of, if you like, how is it going to be implemented in specific sectors? And finally, most important of all to some extent, China was possibly the first country to say, look, if we're really going to address these environmental problems, we don't just need environmental measures, we need a different way of growing, and we need to rebalance our economy. And so in the 5-year plan, look for policies with regard to steel, for example, and heavy industries, and how fast are they planning that the service industry will grow to compensate for the slower growth in heavy industries. So that is a story number 5, and we now come on to the last one. I'm sure you can guess what it is. Well, it's the United States, obviously, as we lean into an election year. The United States has, over the last 2 years, become a leader in climate. And that wasn't the case for several years before that, quite frankly. But now it is the case. And the United States, much to the relief of Europe, became a real leader in the Paris negotiations, and so too the year before as well. So will it continue? The last few months have been pretty good. I mean, normally tax credits for solar and wind are approved sort of at midnight on the last night of the year. This was not only approved in good time as part of a budget deal, but it's multi-year. And the tax credits, both for wind and for solar, are continuing for a year or two, and then they're going to phase down, which is exactly what is appropriate. So that was good, and some people in this room certainly lobbied very hard on Keystone. That's gone. So too, you know, Shell digging for oil in the Arctic has gone. And perhaps most important of all, of course, the Clean Power Plant rule was finalized. World Resources Institute does a great deal of analysis. If this is the goal for the United States, a 17% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2020 and a 26 to 28 by 2025, we do a lot of analysis. Is that possible given executive authority of the president, assuming that there won't be any congressional action? And the answer is yes, but you jolly well need the Clean Power Plant. This is a very, very, central part of that equation. So what to look for? Well, so far, more than half of the states are currently suing the EPA on grounds of, is EPA overreaching? And even, is EPA doing something unconstitutional? So, but the interesting thing is, most of those who are suing are actually still, if you go back, look, see those, so the yellow ones are suing. 4 are not suing. There's 16 actually are supporting. So if you look at these yellow ones that are suing, most of them are now blue. They are actually preparing their plans, which they have to submit by September. So and it looks like almost all of them. There's 9 that have undeclared, 3 are exempt. So it's a pretty interesting time. So the question is, those that are suing and those that are preparing plans. So that suggests there's 2 things we should watch for. Number 1, will the courts rule in favor of, first, a stay? So within the next 2 months, the courts will rule on whether or not the requirement should be stayed. In other words, they will be reviewing whether or not it's legal, what EPA's done, and what they'll rule on first is, do you have to do anything while we're ruling on it? Because it will take another year or so before that. And so watch next month or the following month, will they require states to continue to prepare their plans and implement their plans even while the courts are watching? And the second thing to watch is what will the states' plans look like? Because they have huge flexibility, as you know, all kinds of opportunities for market-based mechanisms, trading among states and so on. And so we're really excited to see what are the kinds of plans that come forward. Now we're, as you can imagine, hopeful that the courts will do the right thing, and we're hopeful that the plans will be ambitious, because we believe the analysis shows that actually this clean power plant is not only good for the planet, it's actually good for the economy of the United States. We've done a lot of work on that. So that's what to look for, but also, relatedly, how will utilities respond? Utilities in the United States and elsewhere have not been the most nimble of institutions. They have tended to stay pretty similar to what they were 50 years ago. And now there's a very interesting process where major corporations are actually, it's something we do together with others, it's called the Renewable Energy Buyers Principles. And these are companies that say, we actually want a lot more renewable, and we insist that we sit down together with utilities to talk about what will it take to make you and we and us sort of move into the 21st century when it comes to renewable energy. So this is actually a very, very important issue for this year. Another thing to watch, will there be more executive action? One got the impression last night that President Obama is not going to just sort of drift away. He's actually wanting a legacy. He wants to do the right thing, and there's several things he could do. I mean, he's still got fuel efficiency standard for large vehicles, HFC standards, methane, and so on. So watch out for some of those. And of course, they'll all be challenged, but will he use all the power at his disposal? And finally, how will climate play out in the debates and in the campaigns? These guys actually talked about it quite a lot in the campaigns. These guys actually haven't. It's not entirely their fault, because this is CNN, and I think 2.5 hours on international issues, 6 days after the Paris Agreement, not a single question on climate change and not a single comment on climate change. So, I mean, what is going on here? This is clearly, if the governor of the Bank of England and the People's Bank of China are saying, for heaven's sake, this affects our economy, why are we not factoring that into our political discourse here? So, so that's it. And then sort of the final question is, so what happens in November? And will we have a continuation of a seriousness of the problem, or will we spend our time counting the chads? And so that's the final question then. Will it continue? So the 6 issues are: the Paris Agreement, will momentum continue? New climate economy messaging, will the message take root in action? Green finance, will the financial system evolve? Will there be a growing movement on food loss and waste? Will China take hold of a new vision and through its 13th five-year plan really show seriousness there? And what will we see in the United States? Thank you very much.